Is adultery the only legitimate reason that a Christian can get a divorce from their spouse? My answer is going to surprise you, but you're going to see how thoroughly biblical it is. First of all, no, it is not the only, and this is important, not the only exception for divorce. Now, Jesus, in talking to the Pharisees about divorce and remarriage, some Pharisees believe you can get a divorce for any and every reason. But Jesus reminded them that marriage is a covenant, that God brought us together, and that it's not easily dissolved. And that's when Jesus says in verse 9 of Matthew 19, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Notice he uses the word sexual immorality. He does not use the word adultery. This is important because adultery was defined specifically in Jesus' time as any person, whether they're married or single, that has sexual relations with another person's spouse. Okay? That person was the adulterer, not the spouse necessarily. The spouse was only an adulterer if the spouse was sleeping with someone else's wife or husband as well. You understand that? That's how they define adultery. Jesus doesn't use the word for adultery because he doesn't want to just narrow down the legitimate cause for divorce by your spouse having sex with someone who's married. It could be having sex with a single person. You see? So Jesus used the Greek word porneia, which is fornication. In other words, it covers all manners of sexual immorality. I remember I had a new member that joined my church many years ago, and she asked if she could have a counseling session with my wife and I. We counseled her, and she said, here's the situation. My husband is in prison and will eventually get out. And I asked my pastor beforehand, when he comes out of prison, do I have to take him back? Because, and this is what she says, he got into prison because he molested our little daughter. And they said it wasn't adultery. And since it wasn't adultery, I have to take him back. I'm reminding the people, Jesus didn't use the word adultery. He used porneia. That would mean any manner of sexual misconduct. And come on, which is worse? For a married man to have sex with an adult woman or to have sexual relations with his own daughter? Come on, which is worse? And if a person can get a divorce under someone sleeping around, then surely molesting a child is even worse. See, and people don't use common sense when they think about this. So Jesus didn't use the word adultery. He used the word porneia, all manners of sexual misconduct. If your husband goes and has some relations with a man, that's sexual immorality too. You can't simply say, well, that's not adultery because, he can't really have sex with a man. It doesn't matter. It's still porneia. You understand this? So this is the exception that Jesus gave. Now, here's what he did not say. He did not say only exception, but rather he gave an exception, except for. Now, people read except for and they think it always means only except for. He doesn't use the word only, but he uses the word except. And you say, well, doesn't that mean the same? No, even in modern language, it doesn't mean the same. When you say accept something, there could be other things you didn't really want to cover that it would cover that. For example, let's illustrate it this way. Sometimes I tell my members, on Sundays, I expect you to be in church, except if you're sick, But what if their kids are sick? Do they say, well, the bishop said only if I'm sick? No, he did not say only if you're sick. He just gave sickness. What if you're out of town? You understand? Do you understand? There are extenuating circumstances that I'm not going to cover when I say accept. But you have to use common sense and say, well, that would be part of it. For example, what if a wife finds out she's married to a mass murderer who kills people and eats their flesh? Does she look and say, well, he didn't commit adultery? Come on! Which is worse, being a mass murderer, eating people's bodies, or committing adultery? Do you get this? Surely anything that is worse than sexual immorality would have to be included in it. I'll give you an example. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, he gives another exception. He says, abandonment. If your spouse leaves you, then you are not under bondage in that marriage. That is, you're free to get a divorce and move on with your life and presumably get remarried again. But that's on abandonment because the person is breaking their marriage covenant. Instead of staying with you, they leave you. Well, how in the world can leaving you mean, well, they haven't cheated, but they left you? They're not even with you anymore. So that's an exception Paul gives. Malachi chapter 2 gives another exception: physical abuse of the husband. Malachi says, I hate divorce, and I hate a man covering his wife with violence as well, saith the Lord. So Malachi even includes physical abuse as a legitimate cause to get away. What I'm trying to point out is when Jesus says, anyone who divorces his wife except for porneia and marries another commits adultery, he's not saying only except for. He's giving what is the most common reason to get out of a marriage is you have someone cheating on you sexually. That's what he's trying to tell you. Why? Because marriage is a one flesh union. And the breaking of that one flesh is having sexual relations with someone not the spouse. You understand? And that is the breaking of the marriage covenant. And this is why Jesus said, except in that. Now, he does not say only accept that. He says accept that. But as we see in language, when we say accept, it doesn't mean it's only that. Otherwise, Paul's wrong because Paul included abandonment. Malachi's wrong because he included physical abuse of a husband. Do you see? There are some circumstances that are somewhat rare. You don't see it that much. Not as much as you see sexual immorality, that could be included in a legitimate reason to get out of a marriage. And to me, I can see someone who's a criminal, who, if you stay with them, you could be found guilty of criminal activity too. You don't want that. Someone who's a drug addict, that could be serious consequences to you, to people around you, especially if he might even be selling it. He's breaking the law. Listen, there are some situations that are so rare, it's not as common as sexual immorality, but that could be a good reason to say, you know what? This person is not worth staying for because they're risking my life and the life of my family. See, and that's really what we find in the scriptures. So, yes, I'm not encouraging any divorce. And I do recognize the number one, by far, legitimate reason to get out of a marriage if you have a spouse who is breaking the one flesh union by having sexual relations with someone not you. That is the number one reason why you have that right to get a divorce. You also have the right to forgive if that person is repentant. But only you and God and that person knows if it's worth forgiving and staying in it and making the marriage work. And I wish you the very best in your marriage.